Hola y bienvenidos a este video en el que vamos a hablar sobre algunas palabras que existen en el español moderno, el castellano moderno, que no vienen del latín sino de otros idiomas. Hello and welcome to this video in which we're going to talk about some modern Spanish or Castilian Spanish words which don't come from Latin, the major influence on the Spanish language, but from other languages. Spanish belongs to a group of languages that we call Romance languages, referring to the Romans and the Vulgar Latin spoken throughout the Roman Empire. About 75% of Spanish words, and most of its grammar and syntax, come from Latin. That's because the Iberian Peninsula was conquered by the Romans in 218 BC. Other languages in this group include Italian, French, Catalan, Portuguese, Romanian, and many more. But the Romans weren't the only ones to leave a strong linguistic legacy in the Iberian Peninsula, because there were also Arabs living there for about 800 years, speaking different dialects of Arabic. So about 4,000 Spanish words that we use today, or about 8% of the language, comes from Arabic, not Latin. Another influence in the Spanish language is from the indigenous languages of America, and this is something that began in the year 1492, quite a pivotal moment for Spain and Spanish, because prior to this the Iberian Peninsula had been under rule of different empires. It was full of different kingdoms. There was el Reino de Castilla, the Kingdom of Castile, which is why we call Spanish castellano. Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs, created Spain, ended la Reconquista, sent Christopher Columbus, or paid for him, to test out his theory about finding a quicker way to get to Asia, to get to India, in which he accidentally came across this whole continent that Europeans didn't know about. And that was in 1492 when he first arrived in the Americas, what they called El Nuevo Mundo, the New World, which was indeed full of new things that they didn't have words for, which explains why there are so many Spanish words for these things which come from the indigenous languages of America. So recapping the influence of Arabic before looking at some examples, Arabs lived in Spain for about 800 years, and they brought with them new technologies, science and political organization, and of course things that they had words for, which then got adapted into the other dialects that were spoken on the Iberian Peninsula and eventually made their way into the Spanish language. Let's take a look at some examples. El aceite, or el aceite, oil, which we use for cooking, not like crude oil, we call that petróleo. This comes from Arabic. This means jugo de aceituna, or juice from an olive, and the word olive also comes from Arabic. So it's quite funny because we use the word aceite to talk about all different types of oil, but it's always referring to the Arabic word for olive. El azúcar, or el azúcar, sugar. This is linked to the classic Arabic word sucar and the Mozárabe azúcar. El algodón, cotton. Just like in algodón, there are lots of Spanish words which begin with al, and most of these, if not all of them, come from Arabic. Words like alacrán, a scorpion, albóndiga, a meatball, alcázar, a fortress or a castle or palace, aldea, a village or a small town, alfil, a bishop when you're playing the game of chess, alfombra, which is a rug or a carpet, algarabía, which is a kind of a commotion, a load of noise, alhaja, a jewel or a gem or a precious object, almacén or almacén, a warehouse or somewhere to store things, and alubia, a bean or green beans. The really widely used word ojalá, meaning hopefully or if God wills, also comes from Arabic, the same root as the modern Arabic phrase inshallah, which is used not just in Arabic but in English by many Muslim speakers of English. Now let's take a look at some examples of Spanish words originating from indigenous American languages, such as Náhuatl, the language spoken by the Aztecs and still spoken by 1.5 million Nahuas in Mexico, predominantly in central Mexico. Because it's so widely spoken there, it has a much bigger influence on Mexican Spanish, but there are loads of internationally used Spanish words that have their origins in this language, Náhuatl. The first example is un tomate, or un jitomate in Mexico, coming from the Nahua word tomatl. And this was a fruit only existing in the Americas, so Europeans didn't have a word for it and adapted the Nahua word for tomato. The word tomato in English clearly also comes from the Nahuas. Although they call turkeys in Spain pavos, in Mexico this is un guajolote, the same in Honduras and El Salvador, coming from the Nahua word, meaning big monster. Chocolate, chocolate, chocolat, chocolada, all these European words coming from the Aztec or Nahua word for this drink, because it was predominantly a drink consumed as a ceremonial drink or even used as a form of currency. Cacao, coming from the Nahua word cacaua. Interestingly, cacahuete, meaning peanut, or cacahuate in Mexico, also comes from a word linked to cacao, because the Aztecs called peanuts the cacao of the ground, the cacao of the earth, as opposed to the cacao from the trees. El aguacate, an avocado, coming from the Náhuatl word aguacatl, and guacamole, also coming from aguacamole. Chicle, meaning chewing gum or gum, also comes from the Nahuatl, from the Aztecs. It meant goma masticable, or chewable gum, or chewable rubber, and that's because rubber trees are also indigenous to the Americas. That's why Europeans didn't have a word of their own for these sorts of things. Maíz, or maíz, is the word for corn in Spain, but also internationally understood by Spanish speakers, and this word comes from the Caribbean Taíno word, meaning maíz, source of life. Corn is kind of like the Americas version of wheat. You can make bread out of corn. You can make Colombian, Venezuelan arepas. Mexicans make all sorts out of corn, including nachos or totopos. In Colombia, they still don't make empanadas with wheat flour. They use corn flour. Instead of eating porridge, you can eat corn porridge in Jamaica, and in Colombia, mazamorra. So corn really was the source of life and continues to be a source of life, a staple food in the Latin American diet. But in Mexico, they don't normally call it maíz, they call it elote. Instead of using the Taíno word, they use the Náhuatl word. Because Náhuatl continues to coexist alongside Mexican Spanish, it makes sense that Mexicans have many more Spanish words coming from this language than we do in other Spanish-speaking countries across the world. Mexicans call their buddies cuates, coming from the Náhuatl word. They call a kid un escuincle, coming from the Náhuatl word. And they might call a house party or a load of ruckers un mitote, another Spanish word coming from the Náhuatl. To finish off, let's look at some examples of Spanish words whose origins can be found in the Quechua language, a diverse indigenous language originating in central Peru and still spoken by over 13 million people in the Andean region of South America. The Incas spoke Quechua, and it's currently the most spoken indigenous language in the Americas. We've already spoken about the very international Spanish word maíz, coming from the indigenous Taíno language, and the very Mexican elote, coming from the Náhuatl language. But choclo is a very common way of referring to corn in South America, and this comes from the Quechua language, choclo. In Colombia, they've got things like arepas de choclo, and there are loads of different types of corn you can find in Latin America. El mate, a popular caffeinated drink consumed mainly in Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and in parts of Brazil, comes from the Quechua word mati, meaning calabacita, or a little gourd, the fruit which is traditionally dried and hollowed out to then use for the consumption of this drink. El cóndor, a bird with a huge wingspan which is the national symbol of Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador and Peru, has great importance in the folklore and the mythology of the Andean regions, and the name of this bird comes from Quechua, cuntor, meaning a big bird. In Latin America, a sports pitch is una cancha, coming from the Quechua word cancha, a patio or courtyard bordered by a wall. Although in Spain they call this un campo de fútbol, or una pista de baloncesto, una pista de tenis. Just a quick reminder to hit that like button if you found this video useful, if you found it interesting. It's just a click of a button or a tap of the screen for you, but it really means a lot to me, and it helps me to know which videos people have found most useful as well. Also, if you have any comments, please do use the comment function below. You can say something that you learned, something that you found a bit difficult, and again, it will help me to plan future videos. And if you haven't already done so, please do hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of the future videos that I'll be posting. If you really don't want to miss out on any of them, you can also turn on notifications.